delighted tonight to be joined by Matt Dalley, co-founder of Simply Eloped, as we talk about kind of his journey from starting that company till now and his experience of going through COVID. So welcome, Matt, and thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Great to be here.
Maybe the thing that we could do to just kind of start off is kind of give us that journey of take us back in time to when you and your co-founder were considering starting Simply Eloped and what iterations you went through to validate that would be a good company to do.
Yeah, totally. So 5 years ago, I was in New York and I was just randomly wandering through Central Park, and I crossed paths with a wedding officiant. And this officiant just told me about how hard it is to be a wedding officiant in New York, how difficult it can be to get gigs. And I came back from that experience just really inspired for whatever reason. I felt compelled to figure out a way to help this fella and other people in that same position come up with a way to get gigs. And so I paired up with my friend Cody, and we spent a year trying to figure out how can we be in Boise and trying to get wedding officiants in New York gigs. And the whole thing, it ultimately just didn't really work out. But while we were doing that, I realized a couple things. I realized that one, there's a lot of demand for elopement services. And two, there isn't a company that's set up on a nationwide level that provides for that. And so my girlfriend, Janessa, she has a background in event planning, and she was just really interested in the idea. And I was like, well, what if we take what I learned from that endeavor that didn't work out and we apply it to something new? And let's try and be the company that it seems like people want. It seems like people want a company that can provide for everything they're looking for when planning a small wedding, but that company doesn't exist. So let's start it.
And what year was this? This was?
So it was 2016 when we launched Simply Eloped.
And was there some trend that you were seeing that made you think that like elopement services was somehow like a good train to hitch to?
Yeah, so a lot of that initial inspiration came from Google keyword planner data. So I spent a lot of time in there with the previous endeavor trying to get an understanding of like what wedding related terms people were searching for. And so in there I saw that elopement terms were generally on the rise. And so that's what ultimately had me kind of thinking about it. But then simultaneously I also had a lot of friends getting married at the time, and I heard a lot of them lamenting about just how stressful planning a traditional wedding is, and how a lot of them were like, oh, I just wish I could elope. It sounds so much better. And so those sort of two things combined, seeing the data from Google suggesting more and more people are interested in it, combined with just sort of anecdotally a lot of friends just kind of also being interested in it, made me realize, well, maybe there's something here.
So let me get this straight. This is how Matt Dalley runs a company, right? So you go to New York and you like your heart bleeds for someone trying to officiate weddings, and then you go and you look at Google keyword searches, and from there it's time to start a company.
Pretty much.
I wish all of us were that wise, because like I certainly have never started a company that way. But it makes a lot of sense, right? Because data out of keywords is going to give you some impression of what your demand for your services might be. So it makes a ton of sense. So okay, so we're in 2016. You validated in some form that people at least are searching Google for elopements. So kind of tell me what the next year after that looks like.
Yeah, so from there, we went back to the Google data and we realized, okay, there are a lot of people looking for the elopements both in New York and New Orleans. So Janessa and I were like, what if we start a brand that launches in these two places? And so we recruited officiants and photographers in both of these places and found venues, and then launched with a totally awful Squarespace site that at the time we were really proud of. We were like, wow, we perfected this thing in Squarespace and it's such a beautiful Squarespace site. Now when we go back on it, we're like, what an awful website.
Wait, you have this like archive somewhere? Can you actually go back and see your past mistakes?
I can. I'm not going to share it with you, Nick, because I know that you have a very high standard for websites. So this is going to be my little secret, but it's out there, and I'm not proud of it.
I'm gonna keep bugging you about this. Like one day I will get the Squarespace link to your website.
Probably not.
I deserve it.
You can try.
For some reason, I deserve it.
Yeah, we had our logo made on Fiverr, and so it very much looked like a Fiverr sort of logo. It was terrible.
But that's part of the story too, though, because you guys bootstrapped the whole thing up to this point. Right.
Yeah. So we at that point didn't really have any money to get this thing going with, and so But what we did have was access to free Google AdWords coupons. And so that's ultimately what we used to kind of get the flywheel going. So if you sign up for a Google AdWords account, you can get a $75 AdWords credit. And so what we did was we got a $75 AdWords credit. We're like, okay, we're going to get $75 worth of AdWords. We're going to try and get a customer with this $75. And then if we get a customer, we're going to use the money from that customer and then buy more AdWords. And then hopefully that spend brings us another customer, and then we're going to use the money from that customer to buy more AdWords. And that's honestly how we got it rolling.
So on $75 then, how many customers did you actually get? What was your actual cost per acquisition in your first go?
Well, I know that with that initial $75 spend, we got one customer,
All right,
and then we got another customer. I don't remember what the CAC was at that point, but it was enough to get the ball rolling.
Okay, so you've now validated that someone will pay you money, which, I jokingly like to say that revenue is the new seed round, so you're so far speaking my language.
Yeah.
But at some point you have to scale here. So you've launched site, Squarespace, be it may, holding my judgment.
Are you not into Squarespace, Nick?
No.
Okay. Yeah. Figured.
And you've acquired your first customer. So talk to me a little bit about like what the pain of scaling was. I mean, and you can kind of get to where you got to, call it, December 2019, but like what did that journey really look like?
Well, it was a mix of lots of excitement and lots of stress. I would say probably 51% excitement, 49% stress. So on some levels, it was really fun. Ultimately, there hasn't been a company that's done this before in terms of set up in a lot of places across the country and remotely planned weddings. And so we felt like we were charting into new territory, and that was really exciting, and it felt really good to have customers really resonate with it. So we started doing NPS surveys relatively early, and our NPS score was consistently like above 85, which is just a really high NPS score. And so people had always really been resonating with what we're doing, and it felt ultimately just really good to be giving people just the happiest day of their lives. And so a lot of the surveys we got back from people were like, wow, I can't believe that I was so stressed out about planning my wedding, and then I found you guys and spent like an hour working with you guys, and then showed up at the ceremony spot and had just a beautiful experience. And so it ultimately felt like we were giving people the happiest days of their life, which was a really fun and exciting thing to do. At the same time, neither Janessa or I had run or scaled companies before. So there's a lot to learn there, and it can be really stressful, and there were long hours. And so, I mean, the first couple of years were intense and on many levels, but it's been so far a really fun journey.
And really kind of for you guys, I mean, a big thing was you were trying to make these experiences very replicatable. And so, a question I've always had is when you're remote managing these experiences, you're never on site, really. I mean, not when a wedding's going on. You certainly have too many weddings to try and have a Simply Eloped rep there. How did you guys go about like ensuring that these experiences would come out the way that you wanted them to as the partner in these people's elopements?
Yeah, so all the vendors we work with are people that have gone through a pretty extensive vetting process. So we make sure that if we have an officiant or photographer that we're working with, like first off, they're just really good, but also they just really care about the customer experience. Like there are a lot of people in this industry where they don't necessarily have a high bar and ultimately just want to sort of make money and take advantage of the fact that people are willing to spend a lot on their wedding day and don't put the same level of emphasis on the customer experience that we do. So we have this pretty long vetting experience just to make sure that anybody we work with on that level is just like really awesome. And so it ultimately starts with that. But then from there, we just have a lot of processes that we've figured out over 4 years now for what's going to make a wedding really great and what's going to potentially cause some friction or potentially cause some stress. And so we've built out all these planning systems that ultimately bring customers down the path of making sure that all the decisions are made are decisions that are going to create a really high quality experience. And we do have teams that are locally staffed and answer phone calls and respond to emails should a customer ever have like a concern or if something's stressing them out. But ultimately, we've just found that like really good processes and really good vendors on the ground can be the magic sauce to really wonderful experiences.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, having a vendor that cares about your values as much as you do, because ultimately in some regards, you're going to have all these micro interactions with people getting married where, they are you as far as your end customer is concerned.
Yeah.
So anyways, so where did you get to? How many weddings are we talking about? How many weddings do you do in 2019?
I don't know how many we did in 2019. We've booked around 6,500 of them, so we've done a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot of weddings.
It's a lot of weddings. Yeah,
that's like a lifetime of wedding planning. If anyone's curious, I'm pretty sure that's how many. Like, if you start when you're 20 and you retire at 65, maybe you do that many weddings if you're wedding planning.
Maybe, yeah. So I think that we're probably the highest volume wedding planning company in the history of wedding planning companies. So we got a lot of experience, and with that experience, we've just, going back to your previous question, figured out like what are the things that'll make the ceremony experience really magical, and then we just make it a point to do those things for every customer.
2019, we booked 6,500 weddings.
Yeah.
Okay. Now here the big question is, spring 2020 happens, world changes. None of us, unless you've been living under a rock and you're not also 6 feet away, you know that the world changes. And certainly in March of 2020, wedding bookings significantly changed. So talk to me about, kind of maybe where your business was at and what snap of the finger changed for you right then.
Yeah, well, it was, as it was for a lot of people, a pretty weird time. Mm-hmm. So we had been coming off our biggest 2 months ever in terms of bookings. So January and February, we were up dramatically compared to the same period last year. And so we were feeling really great. Janessa was in Mexico at a conference, and I was in North Carolina spending some time with my grandma. And while I was there, I was working on putting the pieces in place to raise what was going to be for us a pretty big round of capital. And that week I was going to extend offers to 3 pretty big hires, and so we were really excited. And then out of nowhere, it seemed like everyone that I worked with was all of a sudden freaking out. Like, our customers are all freaking out, our vendors are all freaking out, employees are really stressed. And it just seemed like a switch flip from lots of growth, lots of excitement, to suddenly it's a very different business, and we're no longer managing growth, and instead we're trying to help people through a really stressful and intense time. And on the same token, financially, there was also a really big hit. So we went from a lot of growth to a pretty dramatic slowdown. So it's like, if you compare what our bookings were like in February against April, they were down somewhere between 70 to 80%. And it was a really stressful couple months. It was, yeah.
You guys were also in kind of an interesting spot too, because you had closed around in 2018, 19? Like a seed round.
Yeah.
Okay, so 2019, you closed a seed round. You're pushing that all into growth. Mm-hmm. And for most startup cycles, right, you're trying to set your realistic expectations on that seed round so you can grow into them and then be set up well to go make your pitch for an A round, right? And I assume you guys were kind of in that cycle getting into your next round, and that's always a tough moment if a situation changes like this, because you're not into that raising capital portion yet. And certainly the landscape has changed, so it's not like you can go and try and be like, okay, so I know we lost, 75% of our revenue, but our valuation is still this, right? That's a very hard argument to make, certainly. So, my curiosity is, I know that you guys, had a lot of struggles that you had to really get through. And what was the first moment where you knew you had to pivot your business? What was the first moment you guys had to start making different choices and you really recognized that? And what was the first one that hit you?
Yeah. Well, so the course of that experience of kind of COVID hitting the world and then impacting our business was, at first we didn't realize that shelter in place was a thing. Like, this is my first pandemic. It's probably your first pandemic as well.
My first pandemic, I'll admit.
Yeah. So I was very new to the tactics that one would employ sort of globally to try and mitigate it. So shelter in place, as we were initially planning once COVID became a thing, wasn't a scenario that we were aware of. And so as we were doing that financial planning, the first week that it hit, we were thinking largely in terms of our bookings are probably going to go down, and we're probably going to be relatively slower on that end. But we're also we have a lot of ceremonies that are planned over the next couple months, and so
you have a run rate, yeah.
So we were anticipating some revenue from those, And we didn't realize in that early planning that not only would the sales go down, but we would also be not able to produce those ceremonies. So there would be sort of a hit to these two sources of revenue that we're ultimately relied on. So then about a week into that, when shelter-in-place orders started being released kind of throughout the country, we realized, like, wow, this is going to be a much more dramatic hit to the business than we had anticipated, and that was a really difficult time. We ended up having to lay some people off, which was really hard. We had to kind of defer the salaries of everyone else who was remaining for a while, which I'm not the full salaries, but a percentage of the salaries, and that was really, not a fun thing to do.
And I know a lot of startups, I mean, really always, in some regards, when I hear startups pitching, and you guys are certainly further along at this point, but it always seems like they're like a month from going out of business when I hear these pitches, right? So I'm sure you guys had to do that analysis yourself. You had to sit down and say, okay, pandemic, 75% loss in revenue, here's what our run rate is. Like, how long do we have left? How long did you have left?
In a zero revenue situation, not very long.
Yeah.
Like, in terms of weeks.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, so prior to raising capital, we were profitable, and so we bootstrapped in that way.
Yeah.
And then after we raised capital, we still had a really meaningful, like, most of the money that we were spending every month was the result of money that we were bringing in from our customers, not from the investors. And so moving into early 2019, when a lot of that money from customers is suddenly disappearing, just kind of out of the blue, it really hit our run rate.
Well, this is like the quintessential reason why building capital efficient companies based off revenue is relevant, because you actually have the ability to survive some of these things without a whole bunch of debt coming due, without a whole bunch of stuff. Now, not every situation and every company meets that metric at all, but like there is a great argument here, and you're kind of case in point why being so revenue driven and so nimble at the beginning really kind of saves you when something unexpected happens.
Yeah.
All right, so we've let go some employees, we've cut some salaries. We're now in, I'm going to guess, about mid-April. Yeah. So where was the moment, or where were the series of choices where you realized, like, all right, we're going to come out of this and I need to do X, Y, and Z? What was X, Y, and Z that you put on paper, you had in your board meeting, whatever process you went through to really try and bring you out the other side?
Yeah, so I mean, to be honest, like we were always confident that the company would make it through. Like there was never like a conversation where we were like, "Whoa, is this going to be the end of us?" Because I think we ultimately have those roots in being kind of a profit-centric organization, and so we were never like reliant on investors to get through it. And ultimately, we had sort of done the work early on in the company to understand like what's going to drive profit, and ultimately, in those moments, we were like, well, let's sort of start re-optimizing the company for that. And so for us, that looked like a couple things. Like one, just like cutting all unnecessary expenses.
Step number one, totally.
Yeah, so as you're scaling a company, it can be easy to have money that's going to places that's just not always efficient. Like sometimes you sign up for different SaaS tools that you might use a couple times a year, but aren't really giving that much of a return. And it was in those times where we're like, okay, anything that is not going to get us through the next couple months, we are cutting. And so we dramatically cut back on all of our expenses. We totally cut all advertising, which at the time, was a meaningful amount of our budget. So we scaled that back really dramatically. And so first off, we really cut a lot of expenses. And then at the same time, we were really proactive in terms of finding other sources of revenue. So in February, this probably would have sounded like weird and dystopian, but like virtual weddings are now a thing. And they're a lot cooler than they would have sounded back then. I think a lot of people have been to them now. And
yes, February 2020, no one would have ever even attended a virtual wedding.
Yeah, I remember in March, I was talking to an employee about this idea, and she was like, that is the worst idea. Who would want to do a wedding on the internet? That sounds so terrible. But when you're quarantined, that's the best option for a lot of people.
I want to tell you, I have attended a virtual wedding at this point. So sign of the times.
Sign of the times.
I have been to a virtual wedding. You were a pioneer.
Thank you. Yeah. So relatively on into the pandemic, we were like, well, it seems like people are going to be stuck inside their homes for a long period of time. A lot of people are still going to want to have a wedding experience if it was planned during this, and it does seem like an online wedding is the best option for a lot of people. So we were really aggressive in terms of positioning us to be able to provide that for a lot of people. And so that actually provided a lot of revenue for us. And it also opened up a lot of media opportunities that I think helped spread the word about Simply Eloped in general, as well as what we were doing with the virtual weddings. And
how many virtual weddings do you guys do?
I don't know off the top of my head, but a lot of them.
A lot of them?
Yeah.
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 And what did a typical virtual wedding package look like?
So right now, customers so we sort of have 2 tiers. So on the base level, customers hire us to essentially run tech support for it and help them understand and put all the pieces in place for it. So for somebody who's planning a virtual wedding, they may have never been to a virtual wedding before. They don't really understand what goes into it. And so they get a member of our team who helps put all the necessary pieces in place that make sure it goes really well. And they run Zoom during the experience. Like if you're getting married, you don't want to be dinking around with Zoom and troubleshooting it.
And you probably also don't trust your nephew to do it either.
Exactly, yeah. So at a base level, that's sort of the base package. But then there are certain states that have passed executive orders, and those executive orders will make the virtual weddings legally binding in those states, pending a handful of other requirements. And so for an additional add-on, couples can purchase an officiant from us that can officiate that virtual experience. So some people, they just want the virtual weddings to be totally ceremonial and non-legally binding, and maybe they'll have a friend officiate it. And so for people like that, they'll purchase that base package I mentioned earlier. But for people in the states where there was an executive order making them legally binding, they can purchase an officiant from Simply Eloped and have that person oversee their ceremony.
I think it's really difficult right now to always know that you're making the right choices. Sometimes you make wrong choices, but at the end of the day, the most important part is having your company survive, especially if you're in a position like you guys were, where 75% of your revenue was gone by March 10th. I'm making that date up here, but in March.
Yeah. It's all a blur, so it's totally fine.
I don't even know what day of the week it is
Sometime in the past.
But, people who are creative and people who are innovators will come out the other side. And in some ways, these type of situations can help out a company because, again, you went and cut a bunch of unnecessary things that you didn't think you needed especially now, and you're going to reassess those things, and you might not sign up for it. So your company continually is getting more capital efficient. Now, I have to assume there's a bright side at the end of the tunnel, and you can tell me that you're slowly beginning to book elopements again.
Yeah.
So tell me about that. So for March, 75% of revenue down. You've been doing virtual weddings. How's the future forecast of Simply Eloped looking?
Right now, it's looking really great. So June and July were our most profitable months ever. So, as things started reopening, there were a lot of people that had to cancel their traditional weddings or their elopements, and we're now looking for services. And as we have the technology to allow people to plan those really easily and book them really easily, a lot of people turn to us to help create those experiences. And so bookings are, continually rising, and right now we're in the space of rapidly hiring a bunch of people for the sales team because we're sort of overwhelmed with interest from people who are interested. So it's very much a different story this month than it was in March. I think the opposite on many levels, but ultimately, like in March and April, we just had this feeling that if we could get through this like really, really intense time, there's something on the other side, and I think it's a future that a lot of people will really appreciate us being around and helping them produce their ceremonies. And so it's exciting to be in that spot right now. We're recording this in August, and so the next couple months, who knows what'll happen globally. So we're definitely making a point to be relatively conservative with spending, and we want to just have enough cash on hand to weather whatever's going to get thrown at us, moving into the fall. But as of right now, things are good.
Well, I mean, the lessons learned here, right? Stay capital efficient, cut the fat, pivot to generate revenue, right? And double down on where you have that revenue at, right? And come out the other side, and then do what you were doing well. So, Matt, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me tonight and talk about Simply Eloped. I know these conversations sometimes they're difficult when you're talking about things that didn't go quite right, but I appreciate you being very open and honest with us and the whole Startup Week community about how Simply Eloped's been going. And cheers, my friend.
Thanks, man.
Thanks.